Yeah, so I'd like to welcome everyone to our masterclass on analytics. I think we're in for a treat for you. So we're covering a whole range of different things within the analytics. And delighted, since it's a masterclass, to introduce two past masters to you of both of analytics, who've been working it for a very long period of time, and have also done webinars with us over the years. Duncan White, delighted to have you back. You're working in analytics in a project in France currently.
Yeah, absolutely. In split between Paris and Toulouse, but yeah, no, it's nice to be here again.
Wonderful, and also to welcome back Jonathan Wax from Nice in the City. I know that we've really, I guess, crossed the chasm. 10 years ago, this was an immature or pioneering technology, and is now really quite a mainstream, perhaps immature was the wrong word, but an early adopter type of paradigm, and now it's very much more in the mainstream.
Yeah, I think yeah, exactly right. I mean, we've got over 100 customers in Europe alone now. So I think, you know, we were looking for one or two 10 years ago, and now it's coming in at scale. So I think some elements of the technology haven't changed. It's the receptiveness of the market and how it can impact customer experience. People are looking at it for that reason now.
Okay, and if you want to catch up with Jonathan, a good time to do that would be at the Interactions event in London at the O2 in Greenwich. That is on the 3rd, 4th, 5th of June. I'm going to certainly be there on the 5th of June. So if you want to put a message in the chat room, if you want to get more details, or we'll put Jonathan Wax's email address into the chat room if you want to email Jonathan directly. If you want to watch a replay, you can do that later on this afternoon, callcenterhelper.com/recorded webinars. And if you'd like to log into the chat room, we've got a good number of people logged in already. Here's the address, callcenterhelper.com/chat. Just go in, put in your first and your last name. You can download the slides from there. It's best probably to put the chat room and the webinar slides side by side. We do have another added advantage in addition to being able to download the slides. There's quite a lot of details on Jonathan's slides, so it's quite useful to download that. We do also have a rather nice bottle of French champagne. It's rather nice, Taittinger Champagne Brew Reserve, or if you prefer a box of chocolates, or indeed an Amazon gift card, we can ship that all out. So we'll pick that for the best tip or the best question that is asked, and we'll do that live on the call. But before we get going, I'd just like to understand where in the audience you are in terms of the analytics journey. Are you in the very early days of investigating possible use? Perhaps you're planning to deploy it over the next 12 months. Maybe it's currently under deployment. It might be that you've been using it. Would you class yourself as a basic user, or are you an advanced user? So if you'd like to put those details in, that will give us some ability to then adapt our presentations based on the audience. I think, Jonathan, if we did this 10 years ago, we'd probably have everyone in the top category. Where would you think everyone would be now?
So I think we have the benefit that it's a sort of slightly self-selecting audience because people attending have an interest. So I would probably put, I was going to say, my view is there were going to be more people using it as it's come out, and less in the planning, and then still a relatively high number investigating use. So that's probably how I'd view it.
Yeah, so indeed the answers are about 50-50 split. About 49% are already using it, though only 10% would say they're advanced users, and 34% investigating it, and 13% planning to deploy in the next 12 months. So quite a difference there. I guess that is rather self-selecting there. So let's just hide those results there, and just probably a good time now to move across to Duncan. I know, Duncan, your time is limited with us this afternoon, so if you'd like to perhaps share your thoughts on how people could be using analytics as part of our masterclass.
Yeah, okay. Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. The first thing the first topic we were going to cover was a very broad-based, how does it work? But I think, again, as you are a self-selecting audience, you probably know broadly how interactional analytics works. I know Jonathan has some other slides, maybe later on if you do want something more specific about the nitty-gritty of phonetic versus transcription. But so I thought I would focus here on a couple of areas that I think need to be borne in mind, a couple of areas that I've always advocated that people think of when they're deploying analytics. So this section for me is called how it should work, or things you should bear in mind. And the first one is this question of accuracy, which, you know, listening to Jonty and Jonathan talking about, you know, how things have changed in 10 years, I think people still struggle with this concept of accuracy, and people tend to cherry pick certain aspects of it to suit whatever they're trying to achieve or to sell you. So I thought a quick recap of actually how this works with this rather simplistic diagram. So the big box on the left, the blue and the orange boxes, if you think of that as your complete population of data that you need to get to. And the blue box within that, the left-hand side of the box, is all the relevant elements, the elements that are relevant to your query or your search pack, so the data that you're trying to find. So the circle in the middle, the green and the yellow circle, is effectively what the selected elements, or what gets returned by your query. Yeah. So then the two aspects, precision and recall, basically work on those selected elements. So precision is in your circle of selected elements, how many of the selected elements are relevant. So that's looking at the true positives in the green circle, which I call TP a bit later on, but true positives. So what percentage true positives as a percentage of all of your selected elements. So if you selected 100 different elements and 89 of them are actually elements you are searching for, then you have a precision rate of 89%. Recall is sort of the other side of that equation, or that trade-off. And there you're looking for how many relevant elements are selected. So again, if you look at all the relevant elements, how many of them have actually been selected? So if you have, again, 100 bits of data that you're trying to find, but actually you only get 40 that are in your selected, your group of selected elements, then your recall rate is only 40%. And there always tends to be a trade-off between the two. If you go for a wider recall, so you're trying to get as many relevant elements as you can, then your precision rate tends to drop. If you're going for very high precision rates, then your recall will drop. So, you know, the tighter your query, your precision, then the less relevant elements are going to be selected. So depending where you are on your journey, if people are asking you, and this is the standard question on how accurate is it? How accurate is your speech analysis? And the answer is always, it depends. And it depends, I think, because you can set it up for, depending on the application that you're running, you can set it up, you can change your precision, you can change your recall. But strictly, if you're trying to compare, if you're at the beginning of your journey, you're talking to vendors, and they're talking accuracy, the true equation is this one on the right in the blue box. So it's the number of true positives, the TP, and the true negatives divided effectively by the whole population. So if you get 100% true positives and 100% true negatives, you've correctly identified everything that's in your population, so you're 100% accurate.
So yeah, Jonathan, in terms of accuracy of some of the technology, where would you say it is these days?
More accurate than it was 10 years ago, I think, is the starting point. And again, we still, even that, yeah, in relatively mature markets, get hit by accuracy questions, and the real answer is actually the level of accuracy can vary between 0 and 100, and it depends on, you know, looking at Duncan's view, it depends on how many elements there are in your data set, and if you're searching for 2 out of 2 million, it's a hard search, you know, a hard search. The good news, I'd say, with contact centers is, generally speaking, a lot of the things you're looking for are relatively consistent. Therefore, the degree of accuracy is easily adequate enough to go with what you're doing. And as Duncan said, you know, if you look at things where you can have varied levels of precision and recall, then if you just want some examples to give someone that's fine. But if you actually want to search everything for it from a compliance point of view, you need to be able to split both ways. So I'd say, you know, I think our answer in a production environment, we're at least 80% accurate, but we could then go to, I mean, accurate in terms of precision, accurate in terms of recall. Basically, we're saying we're trying to do a balance of both.
Yeah, no, exactly. So, you know, all I'm trying to get across here is that, you know, be aware that, you know, as you say, it's somewhere between 1 and 100, and you need to understand what people tell you and what you're, you know, and so you can compare. Okay, the second bit is, you know, one of my big beefs, this concept of siloed analytics, and I think this is something that has changed very much over the last 10 years. And you know, what you should be doing, looking for in your analytic program, is things that are changing the business. That you're not just looking for things that are changing within the call center. Yes, that's very important, but if you're trying to build an ROI, which we come on to a bit later, then you need to be looking at business objectives, something that can change, that will affect the entire business, rather than just, you know, it becomes very siloed and difficult to, or can be difficult to get away, depending on the size of your call center, if you're just focusing internally. And historically, again, in the olden days, it used to be a very ring-fenced approach. So, you know, the various analytic vendors, and I've worked for some of them, you know, would be, you know, it's my data, it's my calls, you know, we keep it in, we don't let you, or very reluctantly give you access to your own calls, your own data. And you contrast that now with some of the SaaS platforms that are all about sharing data, speed of data, and, you know, ease of access, even things like open banking. You know, it's all about sharing data and moving data around and getting the base value out of your data. I should say that, you know, Nextelia, because of their roots, were always at the forefront of the open, or on the more open side of the business, you know, even historically. So, and I think, Jonathan, you have, you know, data buses now to interface where you can import and export data sets that integrate with your platform. Yeah. Having said that, within the contact center, there's some very useful stuff that's, you know, that's not specifically to do with with the content, with the speech, with the conversation as such. There's a lot of useful attributes to do with conversations and interactions that can be reported and used within the call center as part of your dashboarding. You know, looking at things, as we were talking earlier on about average handle time, how they vary by outcome. You know, just a quick point, actually, it can be good to have long AHT if it's driving the right sort of outcomes, but it gives you, you know, a lot of ways of slicing and dicing the data that you have. And just a point on the end there, you know, about siloed analytics, about, you know, fundamental attribution error. One thing we found repeatedly over the last, you know, 15 years of doing analytics is people tend to over-egg the importance of the individual in delivering a customer experience. And I would say 90% of the analytics we have done, the agents generally tend to come out very high. I think nowadays, maybe in the early days, you know, agents weren't quite so good, but now agents tend to be, you know, very good, well coached, very knowledgeable. And the problem people have is more to do with the process and the outcomes, the journeys they're doing. So we're tending to do more analytics on the customer journey and not just on individual touch points. So the problem with just looking at the contact center, you can improve your piece, but not realize that there's something downstream or upstream that actually is the key thing that you should change, and that will have a much bigger impact than actually, you know, improving an agent's closing skills or whatever it might be. So think of the contact center analytics very much as part of a larger analytic capability focused on improving the business performance.
So on the subject of advisor skills, we do have a poll on advisor skills. Would now be a good time to do it, or should we leave that for a short while?
We'll leave that for a short while, actually, because then I can give you the answer without having to wait for it. Would be good. The third point, which I've sort of hung on this this framework of 7 key steps of data analysis, which I think they're old. You can Google these and find these all over the place, but they're all pretty much the same. Going back to the previous slide, decide on your objectives. So what is the objectives that you're trying to achieve from a business perspective? But the second step here is identifying the business levers and the frameworks that you can use in order to move those levers. Too often, historically, people, I think, have approached it from the other side and saying, right, I have this data, I have this this tool, this analytic tool. What can it give me? Therefore, what can I do with this data? Which, for me, is completely around the wrong way. You need to say, what are we trying to do? What are the frameworks, the levers we can move? How do we best deploy what we have in order to achieve that? And as an example, what I mean by framework, so people talk a lot about customer experience, but customer experience, the drivers of customer experience, in order to measure it, you need to understand how all these things fit together. So there are elements we know within customer experience to do with rational events like task resolution. If someone rings in, you don't resolve their task, and you make it very difficult for them to do it, it's a fair bet it's going to be a bad customer experience. But also over the last 5, 6, 7 years, this whole question of a rational brain, understanding more about how people make judgments. We've developed a thing called judgmental heuristics, which, if you've been on a seminar here before with me, you've probably heard me talk about already. But it's just understanding, there are the way people make decisions, the way their brain thinks. So Daniel Kahneman, system 1 thinking fast and slow, system 1 thinking, system 2 thinking. All these things, I think, that impact your customer experience. So if you have a framework that you can understand and you can then try and replicate and scale consistently over a period of time, we've built an equation around these various different elements, which gives you a 0.93 correlation with reported customer satisfaction, for example. So if you get that and you can measure it at scale, then you can report that without having to do necessarily asking your customers what they thought, which is a different kettle of fish that I won't get into here. So it's the importance here of not just getting straight into the data collection, data cleaning. It's actually thinking, what is I'm trying to achieve? What framework do I need to utilize in order to get the best results out of that? So those are the 3 areas that I had on how does it work. I don't know, do you want to, are there any questions around that at the moment, or we can push on?
If we'll push on, we'll take questions after your presentation.
Okay, the next thing, which is always asked, is how do you build a return on investment case for analytics? And again, I'm not sure whether it's best to be described as a past master or an old master, but having done a few of these over the years, the only ways really you can build a business model are either by increasing your revenue. So you either sell more, you sell to more people, or you do something that costs you less. Things like increasing CSAT, increasing customer experience are nice to have, but they're not particularly, they're not a hard method that you can build into a business case. And of the 3, selling more, selling to more, making people churn less are much harder to justify. Yes, you can build a case for, yes, we can convert 10% more, we can reach this, that, and the other. But demonstrable cost reduction, in my experience, trumps the rest, hands down. So if you can say, if we do this, we can, I don't know, shave 10 million quid off our infrastructure cost, or we can reduce this, it makes the whole ROI calculation much more easy. How do you reduce costs? We were talking about this when we were chatting at the beginning of the program about demand deflection reduction. How do you get people? How do you reduce the rates into your contact center? And this is understanding the customer journey. How do you deflect from expensive channels to voice channel? Less expensive channels, which normally means from voice to something else, but it depends entirely on what you're trying to achieve. How do you reduce AHT? How do you reduce AHT without impacting the quality of the customer experience potential? And then there's a whole raft of other things around support activity, quality, compliance, agent attrition, time to competency. These are all things that are significant cost elements when you're looking to run a contact center or to introduce new technology. So focusing really on the costs, and I think Jonathan will echo that a bit later on. You know, they tend to be the ROIs that are more successful. This is a real metric from a very recent analytic program that I did outside of the UK, so Northern Europe, and yes, we did manage to increase CSAT, but you know, reduced demand, huge efficiency increase in AHT, but also because this was a business case, this was a slightly wider business case actually, it was a business case for automation rather than just analytics, but it's analytic-led automation. Showed 41% of the contact coming in was avoidable by improving processes up and downstream. So, you know, it's very easy in that particular one to build a business case for a 50-state call center. You know, you could easily sign just under £1 million, in this particular case, €1 million of savings for an outlay of about 40 to 45% of that. So looking for a 6-month payback. And if you slap that on the desk of your FD and said, there we go, I can save you €1 million or €500,000 by the time you take into account the cost of initiating it, then, you know, you're likely to get more attention. And again, just coming back to this, you know, the whole way that, you know, new analytic platforms are being built, the SaaS models, the RESTful APIs, you know, make implementation times now in days or weeks rather than, again, 10 years ago, it's a big, you know, 6 to 12 month project with, you know, huge amounts of professional service fees, tuning engines, language packs, blah, 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 blah. You know, there's a whole new raft of analytic companies driving this speed and driving this reduced implementation costs. The third and final, just checking the time, the third and not quite final bit that I'm going to talk about is specifically about using analytics for contact categorization. And again, this is on that same case study around this Northern Europe public transport system. And this was entirely on inbound voice and inbound chat, actually. And we used, again, the SaaS analytic platform that applied, had a machine learning model to look at the customer's existing data. And what we found, which probably wouldn't surprise you, is nearly 50% of the data was being categorized imprecisely. And by imprecisely, I don't necessarily mean wrongly, but it wasn't being categorized significantly or sufficiently accurately enough for it then to be of real use. So this particular analysis, we were generating 3 bespoke machine learning models. And the first one was the fresh topic one. This is the one we used to refresh the existing issue tree, so looking at the categorization. And this particular platform uses something called human augmentation. So you have a person tuning the machine learning. So if it's coming up with a concept that it can't categorize and says, is this or this, that, the human teaches it and off it goes. And, you know, it takes, I think it took 24 hours to build the initial categorization engine, and then we applied that back to the original data. And all the bucket categories, the inefficient categories, which would be 50% by volume, initially had completely disappeared. So there wasn't an other bucket, there wasn't a don't know bucket. You know, all the tagging was much more relevant and accurate. Sorry. Ooh, hang on a second, hang on. I thought I turned everything off, apologies. So yes, the other category had disappeared, and the tagging was just, you know, much more relevant, accurate and useful. And of the 136 categories that we had originally had to work with, you know, 50% of them disappeared, 30 were redundant as they were no use, and 18% were just out of date or used infrequently. So what you ended up with.
That's probably a good time, Duncan, to we've now got a poll on the number of categories that you have in your contact center. So how many reason codes or category codes do you have in your contact center? Is it 0 to 10? Is it 11 to 20, 21 to 50, 51 to 99, or 100 plus category codes? So it'd be interesting to see what the answers there. I think the example you had there, Duncan, was it 138 in that organization?
Yeah,
And I guess one of the big problems becomes what happens if you have a call with more than one category. I know that often it gets problematic.
Yes, but again, automation can apply more than one categorization to the same call. So you're right, and quite rightly, people tend to have.
So let's have a look at the results. We've got a sample size of 147. So 26% of the audience have a very small number of reason codes, up to 10. About another quarter have 10 to 20. Another quarter, again, roughly have 21 to 50 codes. And about 14% of the audience have 100 plus reason codes. That probably takes quite a lot of drilling down to figure out what those reason codes might be.
Yeah. That's surprising. I would have thought there'd be more. Actually, I thought there would be more in the at the higher end, given the work that we've done.
I certainly think there's probably in that what your old colleague Guy Fielding used to call the Cinderella effect on the number of metrics that you should use. Too many, no one can remember it. Too few, you're not got enough granularity. So there does seem to be a happy medium somewhere in the.
Yeah, very cool.
So Duncan, if you'd like to share with some of your other thoughts.
Yeah, no, sorry, I've just got a pop from. Okay, so so if you replace them to categories, all relevant, consistent, apply. And what we could then do with the models that you were building around sentiment, I know sentiment is a big driver of analytics in some cases, but if you can start adding sentiment in intent across an accurate categorization, if you don't have the accurate categorization, then actually it's of little relevance really to carry on and apply the other tags to it, I think, because you're just getting nonsense out. But if you know your categorization is accurate and you can then start adding sentiment, then these are some of the benefits that we got out of this particular analytic project to enable them to start building their business case for further automation. So yes, you get a reliable early warning system. If you know that your categorization is correct, you can get real-time reporting on how all the spread of categorizations against your contacts. So if you have a problem in a station or with a particular line, you can see a bunch of queries coming in about that, and that will give you an early warning system on that. It gives you an opportunity for revising the customer journey, going back to what I was saying about analysing the whole journey, not just the contact centre piece, understand what it is in the customer journey. Yes, transport system says actual customer journey potentially, but actually understanding what it is that's driving contact and what you can do to reduce it. It also actually highlighted disparities between agents. So again, if you've got the data coming in, you know why people are calling you, you know whether they think it's good or bad. And you can rank that by agents, so you can see which agents are doing well, which in certain, situations, and which ones aren't doing so well, which you can then use to redesign staff coaching plans. But the last one I think is actually quite exciting thing in terms of enabling real-time next best action. So if you're getting contacts in that are historically have been difficult contacts, because you're replicating, it's either the categorization or the situation or the agent, you can actually start to guide the agent, help them with pushing in terms of the information or the way they need to deal with the particular contact at that point. So yes, very real actionable insight, I think, as we used to say 10 years ago. The last thing I was going to talk about is just some interesting examples of analytics, and the one that I still talk about is this impact of on-brand conversations on sales outcomes. And this is something we did for a big broadcaster, looking at their sales channels and actually doing an analysis of the level of brand fidelity of the conversation, which is a difficult thing to automate, I would say, but it's easier to do. There are some things that you can't automate. You need a human to make a judgment about it, but then you end up with problems of scalability. But what this showed is if the conversation was on brand, then you were 2 to 3 times more likely to make a sale than if the conversation was off brand. And all that was about was actually ensuring consistency across the customer journey. So if a customer had gone out, they'd seen collateral, they'd seen posters, they'd seen adverts about the sort of experience that they would expect, and they'd made their decision based on that. If you then come into a contact center and have an interaction that cuts across that, you think, oh, hang on a minute, it's not what I thought it was going to be. Or you have a conversation that is absolutely carries you on your journey, then you can start to see why that happens. So that's the sort of thing, and I still think that's probably, it's a bit sad, maybe after 10 years, that's the most interesting example of an analytic program that I've got, but there we are. And but the other thing was this impact of agent skills. As John T said at the beginning, we've been doing analytics for 10, 15 years, maybe even longer actually, and there's one agent skill that comes out time and time again as being the most important, and I could tell you that without sort of listening to any of your calls on any of your call centers, I think. So this is where we have the poll, John T, that I think.
Indeed. So the poll question that we have is, what is the most important, or which of these following is the most important advisor attributes? Is it politeness, empathy, adaptiveness, listening, or resilience? So from this list, which do you think is the most important advisor skill? So if you just like to put your results in there, is it politeness, empathy, adaptiveness, listening, or resilience? Resilience is often one that we often don't think about with advisors. So let's have a look at the results through. Sample size of 142, and top of there becomes listening skills, followed by adaptiveness. Politeness, interesting, I guess is possibly viewed as a given. Resilience, again, not very high up, and listening is top on our list there, Duncan. What's your findings been?
Well, we came in second. Adaptiveness, time and time again. And I guess you could argue actually that in order to be particularly adaptive, then you need to have listened in the first place. But the ability to understand what the customer is saying to you, to change how you speak or how you communicate, the pace and the tone, to change the information you give based on the context, and actually to I guess it wraps up empathy and listening up potentially, I guess you could say, adaptiveness. But yeah, always adaptiveness, streets ahead of driving. And the only other thing is, you talk to most people, and my very unqualified assessment here is that most board level people have never actually listened to customer calls. So you play them a customer call and they're either horrified or delighted, depending which one you pick. But I think that's a crazy statistic, and everyone should know what it's like to deal with their organisation.
So that's perhaps the first takeaway there, is to get your executive team listening to customer calls. Either send them a CD or invite them down to the contact centre to do that, or if you're in a board meeting, to play them some examples of those calls. So some great things there. Look at the wider impact of analytics across the business. Cost reduction certainly seems to be the biggest return on investment. I thought it was fascinating that 41% of contact shown to be avoidable. Analytics, very good way of highlighting avoidable contact, and using sentiment for accurate categorization. Let's have a look at some of the questions coming in from the audience. Leaf said, is there a call center score for a good or bad amount of recall? For instance, is 10% considered bad? Jonathan, I know you were an expert on these figures. What would be a good figure for recall? Like according recall was the amount of
the true amount of the total data set. So so for example, if you had 100 calls and 40 were the calls that were of a specific category, what number of those percent, how many of those 40 should appear in the category in the system? I would say you can have systems that are tunable, but I would say most organizations, you should be looking for, I would say probably 80+% recall. I mean, because if you're just coaching someone and I can get the recall really accurate, then if I'm only going 2 or 3 calls, then that's okay. But if I say I want to go through speed coaching on 20 or 30 calls, if half the calls aren't what we're talking about, you just reduced effectiveness as a coaching. And alternatively, if you're then saying I want to do some of the process piece, I want to go to a process owner and say your process isn't working, I think you need to have recall that's 80+%. So that's what I would be looking for in an analytics system.
Indeed. Rena's asked a question here, interesting. Can you provide some guidelines on how to improve metadata availability? What should an organization have to do to be more ready to deploy speech analytics in particular? Duncan, I don't know if you've got any thoughts on metadata availability. This is presumably the things that are contained in other bits like the CRM system, like the customer records, billing records and so on.
Well, yes, it can be, but it's also sometimes people talk about metadata, which is actually the data that's associated with the call recordings. So, and this goes back to, I think, one of my earlier points about, traditionally it's been difficult to get some of this information out. If you can get, what you need to tie the conversation data into other customer data, you need to be able to have at least a common key, don't you? So you either, whether it's a customer number or an email address or something, you need to have a common key that you can use across numbers of different systems. If you don't have that, then it makes it tying together, well, impossible, unless you can fudge something. But historically, my problems have been getting the data out of the call recording system or the contact recording system rather than finding it in other external systems.
Jonathan, I know this has been bread and butter for you for the last 10 years.
I'll touch on a bit later, but I would just echo one thing that Duncan said, and it's when we first started talking years ago about CTI, and the problem with CTI was people saying, well, the number's not effective enough because a lot of people were ringing from work, and there were switchboard numbers and so on. And I think what you need to do is to get a unique identifier at the call level. The power, I think, of mobile phones is that an awful lot of us call from a mobile phone, therefore each call has a record. And if you can say this call is linked to this customer, uniquely identifiable customer value, whether it's a phone number or you've entered your customer ID as part of an IVR process. And I would say the one thing that, that fell off the radar, I think, for a lot of contact center people, if we can get it back up and saying the call recording system has to have that identifier so I can then link it to all the other data systems. You may not be deploying analytics this year or next year even, but if you could start that process within the internal infrastructure, then that will set you up to be able to bring in all of the other metadata that exists. It's, the single common key.
Indeed, yeah, single key is quite important there. Comment from Mike, who said a good proof of concept can help build buy-in to demonstrate specific or out-of-the-box insights from analytics. It doesn't have to be a hugely expensive exercise to a point of contact. I guess that's getting a lot cheaper. And final question before I know that Duncan, you've got to drop off fairly soon. How forgiving can voice analytics be on poor quality calls? We've had some challenges around call audio quality infrastructure-wise on our side, but there's no quick fix. And my concern is that any investment on voice analytics would be wasted because the audio is so degraded as to be unusable. Thoughts on that, Duncan?
Yeah, no, you're 100% right. I think back in we were talking yesterday, and the quality of the audio, makes a huge accuracy and therefore the usability of the analytic. If you're using it to try and mine content. I mean, I remember back in the old days when we had 10,000, 100,000 calls for an Irish bank, and the call files were so tightly compressed that they were completely useless. You couldn't get anything out of it. And to be fair, even listening to them as a human being, you were struggling to understand 50 or 60%. It wasn't just the bandwidth; it was very heavily accented people talking to each other, in a broad accent. It was in a very noisy call center. There's a lot of background noise, but then everything was compressed. So, you've got to say, look, you've got to either redo this. And I think there've been huge strides in call quality. I mean, Johnson can tell you more than me, but in terms of getting stereo channels, getting much uncompressed calls, which obviously I guess as storage has got cheaper. has become more economically feasible. But yeah, so in answer to your question, it has a huge impact.
Indeed. Well, that's probably a good point then to pass the baton across to Jonathan. And Jonathan, if you'd like to take us through some of your ideas on analytics, would be good.
Yep. Is my screen sharing?
Yes, we can see it. All fine.
Good. Okay. So just, if I may, just go back to that last question, and it is the answer to the audio quality. Phonetics is less resilient, or is more resilient to it than transcription, so that's one answer. But the key thing is, going back to the earlier about the metadata, if you think you are going down the path of analytics, then if there's this interim step to improve the quality of the audio that you record, that's probably worth taking. And I would turn around and say, we've come across audio that's recorded as MP3. MP3 is really good for music. It's awful for conversations. So if you've got a system that records an MP3, or an option to move to a more standard WAV format, move to the WAV format, and the newer G728s and newer GSM compressions are actually very good. So I think don't use the audio compressions, use audio or music audio compressions. So that's the one other comment I'd add there. Following on from Duncan's themes, I think I've got answers to about 6 questions that over the time we've been asked to do with analytics. But I'll just start off to talk a bit about our approach to analytics, the structure that we take to analytics. So, as you said, we did our first webinar about 10 years ago. Nexidia came from the contact center space. We bought by NICE 3 years ago, and we've broadened out the analytics application. And certainly from our view, so what is our view? Analytics is a program. There's some technology, but you're actually using it for business goals. So that's the whole wrapper. So what we're trying to say is we see organizations generating insights. So that's they're using the application and analysts to create insight. We can then also, once you've done that, you can start to build predictive models off that insight. But the key of both of these two areas is that actually I've done a very, very clever piece of data structuring analysis. If you then don't do anything with it, there is no point starting the journey in the first place. So the operationalization piece becomes key, and this is what helps you drive through what we're doing. So this is how we approach analytics. Again, the broader context of sort of, for us, the customer engagement analytics. Now we're looking at the whole everything we had from the traditional contact center, so both voice channels, web chat channels, email channels. We're looking at the IVR optimization, so understanding how important those channels are, and also containment of other newer channels, so mobile and web app channels. We're bringing in and desktop, we can bring in desktop analytics, we can bring in voice of the customer, and the aim for all of this is to start mapping that out. I think, as Duncan was alluding to, is the whole customer journey. So we've got the whole journey analytics piece. And then lastly, we're now starting to use all of the data we're producing up here, and some other approaches to say how can we improve the routing, move routing to a more personalized level. And I think the change, again, we've seen over the last certainly 2 to 3 years, is for a long time, our approach has always been this: organize, analyze, operationalize. This is what's going on. But the changes we're seeing now are this data is now feeding back into the routing process. So this is all becoming far more, I suppose, a closed loop within the contact center space. So moving from the approach to it, the next one of the other questions, and Duncan looked at this, and I said I'd come back to it, is, what is the business case and how long does it take to implement it? This is just, I think, similar to what you've heard from Duncan. So we see people building business cases around sales effectiveness, i.e. the ability to improve your revenue position. We see business cases built on churn and retention. We see business cases built on cost management, and then lastly on customer satisfaction. And logically, you can build a business case that uses all of this. Because for most contact centers, you've got inbound and you've got outbound, and all of these can come into play. But our experience has been the cost management one is pretty much the area where we see most people initially deploy. And I use the term initially advisedly, because you may start here. So we've got a customer in North America that started in this space, and then has moved on to build a very complex, a sophisticated, I think that's right, churn prediction model. So it's complex in terms of doing a lot of analysis on the calls. Their aim is to call a customer within 2 hours of an inbound contact. So again, because they've effectively banked the savings from the initial piece, they can then go on and go into new project areas. You know, they don't necessarily need to. The application is there and running. All of the contacts are coming through it, but it's a layered approach to how they're using the system. And you know, when we look at doing a proof of concept, we start to talk to organisations about, okay, you can do all of these areas. Which are the ones that that you could take internally to drive a business case? So I would, so the answer to the business case, it's the one that's got the highest value, that you have the highest confidence of being able to deliver within, say, the first 6 months of the program. It's, if it was to do with a process change that's going to take 2 years to implement, probably not the best one to pick. You can roll it. You can say long term that will be part of our business case. So this is the approach we see, and they're just some examples here. We can share some more examples, but basically, people build layered ones, but there's normally one area that is key to what they do. And in terms of the implementation, as Duncan said, so we have a system. Once the deployment of the system, if it's SaaS, it's deployed quicker than if it's on premise. But once the system is up and running, we're getting results out in 12 hours, 24 hours, and then people are starting to make operationalization changes in 2, 3, 4 weeks after that. So I would set the expectation for most people that if you signed a contract today, within 3 months the system should be deployed and having some impact on it. It can be quicker and it can be longer. But we were talking about interesting examples of analytics, and actually what I chose to do here is we did a review at the back end of, well, it's the beginning of January of this year, to see, is there significant difference between the projects we're running in Europe and the projects we're running in North America? And one of my colleagues in North America, who runs a lot of the post-sales implementation consulting services team, went through and reviewed most of the projects they deployed last year. And his view is saying, this is what people were initially deploying the system for. So going back to this case, it could be a multi-tiered case, but this is what they were using it for. And so we've got the specific use case, the primary value, what the analytics was about, and looking at how it focuses the organization. And the fascinating thing here is that in many cases the main value is on cost, is cost reduction. It is, I can use this to save money, or I can use this to save resource that I will then deploy to do something else. So you may actually never cut your budget, but you will be able to do more with your budget. And to pick on, I think, something Duncan was talking about, one of the key areas is if you turn around and say, I can reduce average handle time and I want to reduce it by 10%, I can calculate a saving, but it's actually quite hard to turn around and go, I'm going to cut 10, well, it's probably impossible to say I'm going to cut 10% off every call. However, if you categorize the calls and then start to look at the individual call types, then you can start doing, the area that most people look at, or for the two areas people really look at to begin with, the long calls and short calls, because they're the most obvious outliers. But when you start looking at long call reduction, and long calls can be dependent on your organization how long they are, but let's say a long call is something that's over 600 seconds. If you then say, right, I'll do that by call type, so you should have a consistent handle time by call type. Simplistically, if you've got more than one standard deviation in your call variance, then there's something there that can be addressed. So again, the aim of a long call reduction is to categorize the calls, understand the ones with high handle time, and then to address that. And addressing that, a lot of the time, again, here we were finding for long call reduction was due to agent behavior. So it's the remedy, the operationalization is the system is then driving the coaching process. We've also similar area transfer, tied to this transfer reduction, so the number of times calls are transferred, and the number of times, or the amount of times when the non-talk is happening on the call. There's not an active conversation. And the interesting thing with the many years ago, we did worked with a customer, and they had a big issue with transfers, and that was actually being driven by their compensation program. they had a view of looking at customer saves that could encourage a transfer, so the transfers were happening. So again, sometimes it's not just always, it takes into the whole everything that's going on. So the business, and we've got examples against all of these that we can talk about or share if people are interested afterwards. But the vast majority of the initial cases we see are cost reduction, because that's something that it's relatively easy to predict, to bank, and then get sign off for. But once the system, say you've done those in the first 6 months or the 9 months, first year, the system is there and it's taking all the calls, it's got the basis for the analysis. We can then move into the other areas that you get. So that's where we sit in terms of the types of analysis we're doing. So I think one of the key takeaways here is a lot of the analysis we're doing is not completely rocket science stuff no one's ever thought of. A lot of it is just making sure that what you're doing now is as consistent as possible, and is taking a lot of the variance out that exists. Next question we were talking about, and we'll touch, as I said, I'll come back to it. And this is this idea: how do you bring other data sets into your analytics platform? And again, I'm just going to talk about the approach that we've taken. As Duncan alluded to, we came from a platform where we were always originally we were not part of any other organization. We didn't have any allegiance to any platforms in terms of recording or CRM or whatever. We were absolutely data agnostic analytics company. And so the analytics application sits effectively in the middle, and then we built around it this layer which we call the data exchange framework. And the data exchange framework is a classic ETL program. Its aim is to understand where the data sits within the organization and to pull that data in and to match it to the interaction, so that when we're doing analysis, as well as doing analysis based on the content of the calls, we can do analysis based on some of the additional metadata tags. And we currently, I think that our most developed customers have got about 150 metadata tags. Let's say there's about 10 standard from the telephony infrastructure, the recording infrastructure. They're adding like 140, 150 other fields, and that's because they have that customer ID. So we've got a number of customers in the communication space that say these are the product holdings customers have at the start of the call and the product holdings they have at the end of the call. If you've got that customer ID, you can understand, what their contract date is, the number of, when their next payment's due, or when their renewal date is, when did they make the last payment, whatever. There's all sorts of data that you can bring in, and additionally, there's data you can bring in on the agents as well. So you can bring in tenure data for the agents. You can bring in their training competencies and all that stuff. So for us, the metadata is as key to as the core data. So we've built the data exchange framework. So this is a layer that's like, I think it's more like a donut that sits around the actual application. And the key thing is it sits around the application because it then can also export the data. So the whole thing is based on this open in, open out architecture. And again, if you're looking at analytics applications, I would suggest that metadata is important, and you need to be making sure people have a similar view to you on that, and have the ability to bring in large volumes of metadata from multiple data sources. The next question, I think, was we were pulling together was, can this be used for compliance purposes? And the easy answer is yes, it can. And it comes back to everything we talked about earlier. If you're bringing in all of the calls and you can have high levels of precision and recall, so you've got good accuracy, then you can use the system for compliance. And I've just got two quick examples here. So this is a classic, I would say, contact center view. And so this is looking at, are people following the stages of required, the compliance statements that have to be said when you are selling a specific product. And here you can see this is taken over time. So the data at the bottom comes from the point we've got here, and you can see how compliant people are. And from here you can drill down to individuals to give them individual coaching to see where they're at. The second area of compliance is probably more, I think, is the whole idea of compliance for sort of heavily regulated industries, and there it's a question of, I've got the data, how do I put it through my compliance flow? How do I take it to my compliance team? And so basically we've created a review process with a workflow. So there's a workflow that takes the data with the metadata and the query hits, and then we can build any form of workflow. So this is just an example of a system we can build where we've got multiple queues. So you've got a level 1 queue who can review a system and close it or expire it or pass it on to another queue, and there the same process can have. So again, from a compliance perspective, the system can, at this level, it's going through all the calls and it can say, I'm going to raise all of the exceptions. And so you're effectively doing exception-based compliance. If the call's not raised, then there is no issue. And we had a review with one of the investment banks earlier on this year, and they deployed a system. It went live in November of last year, and they said in the last 3 months they had more alerts than they had before, but they were real, or so they had less alerts than they had before, but the alerts they got out of the system were actual ones where there was reason to take action rather than ones that could be discarded.
We're running a little short on time, Jonathan, so perhaps if you'd like to sort of do your concluding remark.
I will, let me just, can I get to... So, some takeaways from where we are. I haven't got 7, I've only got 5. 5 things to remember, I would say, if you're looking at analytics or want to improve your analytics. So the first one is outcomes. It's all about what you're going to change. The application has got to be good enough to do the analysis. And yes, some are better than others and do things differently. But if you don't want to do something with it and change what you do, there's no point starting. And the change is find the business, link it back to the business objectives. If you build a business case, the analytics has got to support that. The third one is it is something you do. You need analysts to help it. Duncan was talking about a data team, however you want to refer to it. People need to use this, but more importantly, the company has to understand that this is basically just a business process that you're embedding. My favorite one is, if you don't start, nothing changes. Lots of people have been looking at analytics for a long time. There's business cases, we can do POCs, but you actually do need to start. Because if you don't start, nothing will change. And then the last one is, it is going beyond the traditional analysis of a call recording or a web chat. We're starting to be able to do far broader analysis to take the whole of the customer journey space that you're looking at. So, I think the key thing is what's happened in the last 10 years. It's become more mature, it's deployed at scale, and it's probably more business focused now when it was before. It was more technology focused.
Indeed. Well, thank you very much for that, Jonathan. Before we just go into some last a couple of questions from the audience, if you'd like to see a demonstration of the nice Nexidia analytics system, looking at both at speech and wider analytics, just put your details, just tick the box there, and I'm sure Jonathan can arrange that for you. We've got just a couple of quick audience questions here. The first one is, what strategy have you seen being used to capture first contact resolution with speech analytics? Is it by making mandatory requests for agents to check for resolution, or is there a different method? Jonathan, any thoughts on that?
I would say the most effective systems we've seen have been when we're actually doing it off some of the CLI data we're getting, so the customer number, so you can see repeat interactions, and then what's important to understand what's caused those multiple interactions. We also we also search the data for comments. People volunteer they've called before, or you can ask customers, but generally speaking, the best analysis comes when the data says this is a repeat contact from that number or that email address or whatever, and then you build a chain of multiple interactions that you do the analysis on.
Indeed. Well, that's unfortunately all that we've got time for today. So if you'd just like to put in the box what you like best about today's webinar, today's winning tip is from Jason 18. Typically, when I look at sentiment, I look at the top and bottom 10% in the distribution to see where the trouble calls and the good calls are. Trying to look at an exact sentiment score can be misleading. Look at the average score per topic, though, can be very revealing. Just a reminder, if you wanted to meet up with Jonathan, and I'm also going to be at one of the sessions, then the interactions in London on the 3rd, 4th, 5th of June. I'm going to be there on the 5th of June. If you'd like to complete the survey when you leave. I'd just like to thank our two speakers. Duncan White had to just dip off. Jonathan, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Jonty.
And we're going to be back in a week's time. So thanks very much, and we look forward to seeing you then. Thank you then. Bye-bye, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.